Gone Home was released by the Fullbright company on August 15, 2013. This game sought to tell a simple story experience underneath the surface of its more ominous world building. This title seemingly followed the rise of the walking simulator genre that sprung up back in 2011 following the commercial success of the Stanley Parable. Other games that would come out over the following years would be titles like Dear Esther, Proteus, and Journey. The Fullbright company was a startup co-founded by Steve Gaynor, John Mad Nordhagen, and Carl Jamanja. For the scope of this video, I'll be focusing on Steve Gaynor, who left Irrational Games back in 2012 to pursue his indie development ambitions. Irrational Games is the company behind the Bioshock series, with Steve Gaynor's role primarily being in development of Bioshock 2's campaign DLC, Minerva's Den. The critical success of Minerva's Den, in part because of its excellent environment storytelling, would eventually leave Gaynor itching for something new. Gaynor wouldn't stick around for the development of Bioshock Infinite because he began yearning to develop smaller projects, perhaps those that could best show off his environmental storytelling capabilities. This leads directly into Gone Home, a game that is foundationally structured around environmental storytelling. And this is where the spoiler warning comes in. If you are at all intrigued in Gone Home or think that you might want to play it at some point, please leave this video and either play the game or watch a silent playthrough, because this video will be spoiling the game with no discretion. I've uploaded my silent playthrough of this title for convenience. Feel free to watch that to get caught up on what this game is about if needed. On the surface, Gone Home just seems like another walking simulator. However, a confused and anguished legacy permeates this game in a way that can be difficult for new players to entirely understand. Depending on who you ask, Gone Home failed for a numerous number of reasons. Its marketing promised a game that never came to be, one could say. It won awards it never deserved, another may cry. This is just another game with silly beliefs that probably slept with the journalism industry, some will mutter. So this video is ultimately going to argue about Gone Home's validity in the gaming space, and some of the dissonance involved in how consumers think of marketing, video games, journalism, and even just the fundamentals of how people build expectations. This video doesn't care about player expectations or how they felt during the time, except to discuss the who, what, when, where, why, and how. All pieces of media should ultimately be designed with a purpose. That purpose can be anything from making money, to commemoration, to making players experience a specific feeling or state of mind. And this video is focused solely on whether or not Gone Home succeeds at its purpose. The marketing of Gone Home has been criticized for being misleading. Supposedly it led many consumers to believe that Gone Home was a horror game. Players were not only confused but upset that the product they received wasn't what they were expecting, and would go on to give the game a bad reputation among some circles. There are also numerous other criticisms about how this game failed to live up to expectations and that it was too expensive for what players received. So before we get into the game itself, let's talk about what players saw, expected, and paid before they played it. As stated, some believe that Gone Home was meant to be a horror game before they played it. In a few ways it makes sense why this happened, as Gone Home does use the development of its eerie atmosphere to play on expectations, but it feels almost a little too obvious that something was up with Gone Home. The numerous trailers for this title are clearly not meant to terrify or thrill, and the eerie elements of the game are deconstructed almost as immediately as they are established. This is a temporary effect to ultimately hide what the game is about, and the trailer somewhat indicates that it doesn't want to tell the player what it's truly about. I'm going to play a small 20-second snippet of the trailer, but please watch the full 88 seconds if you can. You'll find it in the description.
I'm sorry I can't be there to see you. I'm just sorry. But please, whatever you might find, don't tell Mom and Dad. I don't want them to know. I don't want anyone to know.
So that's not cherry-picked either. There's truly nothing in this trailer that screams out fantastical horror elements. It arguably doesn't show anything that dark or sinister. But this is the trailer from a day after the game came out. So let's look at the gameplay trailer uploaded back in 2012, the full video of which will also be in the description.
New house, new school. Worst of all, my big sister's gone for a year. It doesn't feel real. But I'm not gonna let it change me.
Still not that scary, huh? So let's drill down on the question, why did players get so thrilled about this being a horror game? When players go to watch the trailer for a new game coming out, what is the reason they are watching this trailer? Well, a couple of reasons can be assumed. Firstly, trailers are watched to distinguish what the game is going to be about, its genre, plot, setting, etc. Secondly, players want to know if the game looks like it's going to be worth their time. If the game's trailer is pretty shoddy or shows off low quality features of the game, then players are less likely to buy in. Trailers, from a marketing standpoint, have been almost predefined by these two what are expectations, but I'm going to call limitations. So when a trailer comes out that doesn't tell the player what it is, and is pretty ambiguous about what the game has in store, players see fit to build their own expectations. In fact, it's a common problem some video games face where ever-growing expectations eventually cause a game's reception to falter. On the surface, Gone Home's trailer works. It shows off what the game is about, its best elements, and includes a tinge of horror to imply that something more drastic is at play. Players were ultimately disappointed to learn that there were no thrilling horror elements. The game was ultimately grounded in reality. And Steve Gaynor understood that this game wasn't going to be for everyone. In an interview hosted by George Weidman of Super Bunny Hop, Gaynor makes this apparent.
With a bunch of folks.
Do you think it has kind of a limited appeal?
I guess all I mean is there are a lot of games you play where if you don't like one part of it, you can still enjoy the game because you like the other part of it. You know, like it's like, oh, well, I don't really like the missions, but I like the open world stuff. Or, you know, the story's not that good, but the platforming's really good or something. And in Gone Home, it's really just sort of like you either like exploring and finding the story or there's nothing else in the game. So, you know, it's the kind of thing where if it doesn't click for you, then it's not your thing. But, and so we didn't know.
What no one expected, however, was that Gone Home would be called a major failure. Insert downward thrust video essay called The Gone Home Syndrome, or The Gone Home Incident if you actually watch the video. This is just one of numerous pieces talking about the failings of Gone Home as a piece of media, but this one is particularly special as it highlights just how highly some critics and essayists think of themselves. The video peddles this idea that Gone Home was created to manipulate people into paying it for a horror experience, only to pull the rug away. It talks about how exploitable the horror game genre is, while also talking about a game that was never meant to be horror. It exacerbates the quote-unquote issues the marketing materials have, while at the same time saying nothing. The Gone Home Syndrome, or Incident, what have you, is just rubbish essay material pumped out to reach a status quo on Downward Thrust's part. Like, just look at how poorly researched and thought out this video was.
Sorry, but even if you explore every nook and cranny, at best you're getting 4 hours of gameplay. And yet, not a single reviewer talked about this. Both corporate and indie, nothing.
On the topic of conventional consumer advice reviews, I should probably also say that this game is only 2 hours long. It still looks like they haven't put the price on Steam, but RPS is reporting $20, which would mean that this game has a $10 per hour value that isn't exactly competitive with most other games.
And I'm including this video here to preempt my opinion later on in this essay that a lot of the content that came out about Gone Home is ultimately empty and meaningless, lost to the fact that their impact got superseded by the piece of media it sought to destroy. There are many people just like Downward Thrust, and where a game fails to meet the expectations of one person, they see it fit to transpose that disappointment onto others. On its own, there was nothing wrong with the marketing of Gone Home, despite what mediocre game essayists or journalists may say. However, the vast space of internet noise creates opportunities for like-minded people to assemble. Those people can then become a vocal minority that may begin to further skew others' opinions towards theirs. This vocal minority, fueled by Gone Home's critical success and its awards thereafter, would go on to get Gone Home wrapped up in a controversy known as Gamergate. This video will touch lightly on Gamergate later, but it's more appropriate to talk about Gone Home's price and the actual game beforehand. Another important criticism of Gone Home was that it was simply not worth the $20 asking price when it was released. And this is an angle that comes from typical consumers. Typical consumers in this instance are those who have limited money that they are willing to spend on things such as video games. Given that these consumers only have so much money to spend, it begs the question, what is the value of money to consumers? It's almost ridiculous, but one has to account for the current landscape in which video games are priced. Video games on the PC market are constantly depreciating in value. On marketplaces like Steam, it is common for newly released titles to see discounts and sale prices of 10% or more, and this seems to increase exponentially a few years after the game's release. As of writing, Gone Home has been priced down to $15, and has gone on sale for typically $6, but sometimes as low as $3. This is a price that some would argue is far too low for a game like Gone Home, right? Games like Journey and The Stanley Parable are $15 full price, and those games barely received criticism for being overpriced. So where does the line get drawn? Unfortunately, knowing how much to charge for a video game is immensely difficult. The amount of man-hours to go into a video game can lead developers to charge more, ultimately dissatisfying customers. And this isn't mentioning that other media, like movies on DVD and Blu-ray, still charge about $15 or $20 for oftentimes a 2-hour experience. Video games have much more consideration that go into them. Video games need to measure play interactivity, have to make every perspective immersive, have to guide a player's attention towards developer-created goals, on top of the choreographing, framing, and audio work that would go into a movie. The main difference between the two is that the movie industry is regulated by large entities who can keep the price steady. Video games have ultimately broken free of this and are much more prone to the argument that the game is too expensive. Because Gone Home is a third of the price of a AAA title, many would assume that it has a third of the content. What Gone Home offers, however, is comparable to a movie. It's an experience more than it is a video game, sure, but that does not make it any less deserving of a fair price tag, especially in a market where video games are constantly depreciating in value. So, if not a horror game, if not a game built on theatrics, what is Gone Home? Gone Home is an environmental storytelling exploration game about coming home from a trip overseas and discovering the home of the player's character's family. You play as Kate, who walks about her new family home on a late night. A letter on the door signifies that something has gone awry, but for some reason Kate is undisturbed by this. Through exploring the house, the player will quickly come to understand the true plot of the game. There is no murder, there are no frights, instead there's simply the story told by the protagonist's younger sister, Sam. And that's a tale of the hardships of same-sex relationships as a teenager, and the sacrifices that some make to be happy with their significant other. It puts this plot front and center as Kate traverses the house, but there's actually a lot of other subplots going on as well. The house has been packed with minute details that, while inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, really make the player feel smart for connecting the dots. And there are a lot of dots that can be connected. It could take a couple playthroughs in order to get the full picture. It's family drama at its finest, a mix of conflicting relationships and untold secrets and hidden objects around the house. A family that is so close, yet so far. And this is the singular scope of the game, the thing that players either love or hate about it, the only marketing bullet point it hangs on to. If players aren't interested in exploring this house to find the story, then Gone Home can never live up to their expectations. And the exploration elements are constructed to be organic. There's objects and paperwork scattered all around the house because they just moved in. The player can find all sorts of interactable objects placed around that work to explain how and why the family moved to a new home, the underlying family issues at play, the subplot of a struggling writer, and so much more. The game is also set in the 90s for a lot of practical and logistical reasons. It makes sense why there's notes and toys and childlike things all over the house. It's a time when the mainstream internet didn't exist. All these elements are corroborated into an experience that is about 2 hours long, a format and length that works tremendously well with this genre. The walking simulator can only work up to a point. When you begin to draw out that playtime, it only becomes more and more apparent that the player is merely walking around experiencing stuff that mostly happens at them. Catering these experiences to be short helps keep the idea concise, and that's ultimately what any piece of media ought to do. Gone Home is a game that has multiple underlying plots to it. But front and center is the tale of how Sam met Lonnie and what their relationship developed into. The main story is told through audio logs and some environmental work to give a chronological sequence of events that led up to just a few moments before Sam abandons the family home. Sam gives some backstory on her upbringing and the friends she met and how a moving affected her ability to connect with others. She begins to dissociate with older friends and connect with new ones. She meets Lonnie and they quickly discover they're in love. Lonnie is initially set to leave for the military, but changes her mind last minute to pursue a relationship with Sam, convincing her to leave her life behind and join Lonnie, who's now gone AWOL. Like described earlier, this isn't the only plot the game has going for it. There's a lot of details packed around the environment that tell small experiences and ongoing stories about love affairs and the struggles of being an author. And these subplots arguably make the game much more appealing than just the main story. It helps to build on the fact that Fullbright was developing a game centered around environmental storytelling. And that type of storytelling isn't linear. You can pack a lot of details in there that don't just tie into the primary story, and Fullbright has utilized this environment excellently. There's much more to find in Gone Home than just the main story, and the exploration is what the game is all about. So the main story, Sam's relationship with a girl named Lonnie, has been panned by a lot of critics. Not for particularly good reasons, but merely because it's not what the critics wanted. There is a 20-minute critique video put out there by Eon Cool that is almost close to being good, but is ultimately weighed down by an exponentially decreasing professional tone and jokes that argue by way of absurdity. Here's what he has to say about Sam as a character in the primary plot.
There's a lot of backstory for almost every character in this family, but the game wants you to focus on Sam. Now, this is just me, because I don't care about Sam's story, but I wish that the developer had just not included Sam's narration. I get just focusing on one character to tell a story that you want to tell, but they tell the other parts of the story, well enough. I don't know why the developers didn't just let the player take away what they wanted from the game, instead of pushing this generic teenage rebellion no one understands me story. I'm just gonna flat out say it, I don't like Sam. At first she seemed like the typical outcast with little to no friends, probably gets bullied, yada yada, who hasn't been there?
There's also another review written by RGT85 that claims that Gone Home is the worst Game of the Year winner ever. And he summarizes the appeal of the plot like this.
Let me ask you something. If this girl was in love with a boy, and the whole story was about a girl and a boy, would anyone have given two shits about this game? I honestly don't think so. It would have just been another cliche, poorly done indie game that with decent graphics, but no real narrative, no real story. It's just so mind-blowing to me.
So there's very clear conflict between what these critics perceive as good writing and the clear intentions from the developers, which are spelt out in George Wiedemann's interview.
What's real? Ghosts aren't real in the game, just like they're not real in our own everyday lives. But to know that people, there's no reason for them to assume that's true, and to kind of use those tropes and the red stains on the tub and stuff to say okay, I know what you're expecting.
There's a Ouija board, there's these secret nooks and crannies.
Yeah, and it's we're gonna acknowledge the assumptions by putting that on screen, and then every time we do that, subvert it by saying no, really, it's just a normal family. So hopefully by the end, you're invested in finding out about the characters and not so when's the ghost finally gonna show up,
All too often do critics pan characters for being obnoxious, stuck up, and seemingly having any flaws that would make them terribly human. But if a developer or artist makes a character that has no flaws, then they've developed a Mary Sue. The middle ground here is that the flaws don't actively disturb or go against the player's ideals, or that the piece of media is based around those flaws. Consumers don't like it when a character is filled with humanistic flaws, such as teenagers being somewhat loud, moody, annoying, and maybe even sexually explorative. But rather than engaging with the material given to them, then applying the developer's intentions directly to the piece of media created, consumers and critics would rather point and say, in a blanket statement, "Isn't this thing bad?" And some critics do this by merely shrugging off the plot as just vouching for the gays, and others do it through bombastic, absurdist sketch comedy, or some just ignore what the game lays out in front of them.
You can completely drop them from your life if you want. That's okay. What's not okay is what Sam does. She pushes away her old friend for no real reason. He's just a weirdo, I guess. But then she starts using him for his things. She borrows his NES just because he has one. Honestly, after I started hearing about a lot of the selfish things she's done, my indifference towards Sam started to accelerate to an intense discontent. Discontents, if you will.
Daniel finally came over to get his game. I'd been dreading it. But he brought this story with him that I wrote when we were little. I started reading it, and then there I was, crying at the kitchen table. He asked what was wrong, and I was thinking about how we used to be friends, how much I'd taken for granted. But instead, I told him about school, and Dad, and Lonnie, and then how sorry I was that I wasn't his friend anymore. He gave me a hug and said it was going to be okay. For some reason, I almost believed him.
Sam's motivation for running away seems to be less, "I'm gay and my parents hate me," and more, "I'm in love and my parents don't want me making any rash decisions, but I will anyway." This story would be exactly the same whether Sam's lover was a boy or a girl. Lonnie and... Oh, that's Sam's lover's name, by the way. I forgot to mention that, but I don't really care. Anyways, Lonnie could have been Lenny. And the story would be exactly the same crap it already is.
And so here's the thing. I was prepared for them to be mad, or disappointed, or start crying or something. But they were just in denial. You're too young to know what you want. You and Lonnie are just good friends. You just haven't met the right boy. It's a phase. That's what I didn't see coming. That they wouldn't even respect me enough to believe me. Well, joke's on them, 'cause they're in for one very long phase.
Gone Home's effectiveness and why it has been praised isn't just because the game touches on LGBTQ topics or because it's set in the 90s. It's a game that begins to touch deep into American culture. And yes, part of Gone Home's message is clearly about same-sex marriage. The game's setting, Oregon, didn't even recognize same-sex marriage until a few months after Gone Home released. But another part wants to paint the picture of a typical, stable, yet ever so struggling average family of America. The game doesn't necessarily have anything to say about this family. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't address Sam's admittedly irrational behaviors or her parents' neglect. It simply shows what the family is and lets the player's bias take over. This is what is so impactful about Gone Home. It's not built to express an opinion. It's built to be an exploratory walking simulator from the talent that left Irrational Games. Does it fail to incorporate well-designed puzzles? Of course. Does it fail to give the player the ability to try and rebuild the family and have some agency over the situation? No, but it doesn't need to. Gone Home won the awards that it did for a reason. It took a valuable idea and applied a limited scope to deliver a product that aimed to merely paint a picture. Nothing more, nothing less.
And Gone Home doesn't have a lot of those things, you know. Like it's a small, very focused experience. You know, it's not like you're going to be making story decisions that branch the story, or you know, you aren't going to have dozens of hours of gameplay or anything. But the other side,
Gone Home's environmental storytelling elements have been universally praised for being highly in-depth, exhibiting great attention to detail, and being evocative of rummaging through a typical house. There are minor details like interactable pens and napkin boxes and rolls of toilet paper that ultimately serve no other purpose than to immerse the player. The game features small details everywhere, like plaques that clearly aren't professionally made, a pillow fort in the entertainment room, a bottle of hair dye next to a red-stained bathtub. These elements create a barrier of understanding in Gone Home's story. Sure, anyone can simply pick up and play through the main story, but you can typically tell who has or hasn't really combed over the house and put all the pieces together. Yes, the game is primarily focused on Sam as a character, but there's a lot of other things going on to signify that her love interest isn't the only problem with this family. And it does all of this through letting the player put the story together themselves. Perhaps that level of freedom given to players knocked this game down a couple pegs, as critics can overlook these details and complain about the main story. The issue with the focus of the game, from the perspective of the critics, is that Sam's love story is shoved down your throat and distracts from the more interesting side elements. But I believe that if the game were to shift focus on these smaller sub-stories, it would actually kind of devalue the purpose of the game's environmental storytelling. The main plot is in place for a logical reason. You are playing an adolescent female who canonically cares a lot about Sam, despite whether you actually care or not. This character has just arrived in a new home she has never been in before, and the house is clearly not done being unpacked, with lots of things being disorganized. Fullbright, with a limited amount of resources as an indie startup, had to figure out how to effectively construct an environmental storytelling setting that could be quickly developed and released as essentially a proof of concept. Many will argue that if Gone Home is comparable to a proof of concept or a demo, then it isn't a complete game that deserves Game of the Year, and oftentimes when critics say, well, the game should have had X, Y, or Z, they aren't exactly thinking about the actual implementation of those ideas. Simply adding horror elements or non-playable characters would have taken Fullbright much more time to develop and implement for results that are ultimately contradictory to what the company had in mind for its storytelling. It's clear from almost all perspectives of how the game is constructed that this house is meant to be abandoned, the player is meant to find the deeper story past what's initially present, and if the player doesn't wish to engage with that, then the game has nothing for them. These are things that the game, and rather Fullbright, expect to be critiqued on, hence why this critique is not valuable to the company. Fullbright already understood its shortcomings as a games producer, and furthermore upped the production value, interactivity, and exploratory elements in their later title, Tacoma. So with so many faults in mind, and knowing that this game isn't going to be for everyone, why was Gone Home successful? The backlash from Gone Home has been enough to stain the game's reputation for the rest of its shelf life. This game received critical acclaim when it came out and nabbed a few rewards for its innovative view on storytelling, like a BAFTA Games Award for Debut Game, and a VGX Award for Best Independent Game. On top of that, several game journalist outlets like Polygon called it their Game of the Year, and PC Gamer gave it the title of Best Narrative. But where Gone Home received these awards, it beat out other games in the process, like The Last of Us, which actually won DICE's Game of the Year, Grand Theft Auto V, and even, funnily enough, Bioshock Infinite. This led to lots of amateur media trying to argue how Gone Home was utterly undeserving of these rewards. And this is the part where people don't understand how journalists view video games. Video games are much more than just the final product itself. It is a testament of all the man-hours that went into it, the compilation of complex problems that had to be solved, an immeasurable amount of work dedicated to developing and formatting a story, and so much more that a lot of these details can come as afterthoughts to developers. What I'm trying to say is that games journalism doesn't, or at least shouldn't, look at games on the surface. However, there are a lot of poorly written, very surface-level articles out there that don't do games coverage great. Games journalism, beyond the initial reviews for readers, really ought to go deeper into the complexity of any game in question. What's the talent that went into this game? A man hailing from Irrational Games, a psychologist, an environmental level designer, and a comic book designer / author. On its own, this seems entirely inconsequential, but factoring in the success of Minerva's Den and the growing indie game market at the time, this product was seemingly falling into place at the right moment in the right time. Indie games at this point were still part of a very barren genre with only a few names sticking out. People like Edmund McMillen, who developed Super Meat Boy and The Binding of Isaac, Marcus Persson, who released Minecraft that has since exploded into a billion-dollar intellectual property, and Daisuke Amaya, who developed the popular freeware software Cave Story. These were some of the mainstay names of the indie market during this time period. The point is that indie games were a much more niche market in the early 2010s than they are in the present day. Seeing a developer not only leave the AAA industry to pursue indie games, but then also produce a game that has been critically acclaimed, gave journalists an aha moment. Gone Home showed journalists, and even some players, that the indie market was not only growing, but that it was also capable of saying things that massively funded developers would shy away from. Other indie games in comparison lacked that same power to be evocative because they lacked the publicity and support. Gone Home's legacy isn't just being afraid to dip its toes into the LGBTQ thought bubble, its legacy is being a successful pioneer at truly showing off what indie games are capable of, merely through storytelling. It's a game with scope. It's a game that doesn't have a message much like that of a painting. It's a game that was developed from the heart of a man who sought to leave the AAA industry behind. It succeeds in all of these criteria. It is a product that works and has been maligned. But where it came at the right time, there was also already a controversial upset just past the horizon. So Gamergate is weird. That's not an opinion to flag my position on either side. It is more to highlight the immense difficulty that comes with explaining what Gamergate is and how it relates to Gone Home. Because Gone Home was retroactively targeted by Gamergate. Gamergate is best described as a conservative movement that looks to pull video games away from the discussion of progressive topics like sexual identity, political reform, and the changing landscape of video games. It should be mentioned that Gamergate hasn't passed. It is a movement that still continues on today, if not in far less power than it once had. Gamergate started over accusations that a game developer, Zoe Quinn, had deep relations with journalists in order to get good reviews written about her game Depression Quest. And the highlight is on the word accused. Whether or not these accusations ever had any legitimacy is irrelevant to the summary. The main argument levied by those who participated was that game developers and journalists were in cahoots with each other to push out mindless violence in video games and produce more quote-unquote political topics in gamers' cognition. It sought to spark the topics of ethics in games journalism, or, at worst, was a smokescreen so that a group of people could arrest game developers and journalists for their own gains. Gamergate in a lot of ways symbolizes the outdated viewpoints and expectations that Gone Home was subjected to back when it launched. An audience of people who expected mindless gameplay and AAA development to continue to sweep the landscape, and people who thought that video games had no right to say anything. It's Mario, it's Call of Duty, it's even something like Minecraft, but it's not anything that can paint a picture as detailed as the one that Gone Home was willing to paint. Perhaps games journalists are done playing the same things over and over again, like what was being produced by AAA development studios. There was plenty of media that came out about Gone Home that is essentially garbage by today's standards, that have since failed the test of time. There's the few flawed videos I've shown off already, but digging reveals a trove of distinctly unique and flawed articles that either seek to spark player emotions or try to point out problems with Gone Home that aren't problems to begin with. As much as these essayists try to construct pieces that argue what Gone Home should have been, they ultimately miss the point of why Gone Home is the way it is. This form of analysis and critique is all but empty to a development team that understands these shortcomings, and with Gamergate and some of the more extreme reactions of the internet space, this is what Steve Gaynor had to say.
But I think that it's part of. I think that the strong positive reaction from people that were really excited about it drove the backlash from the other side, where it's not like this isn't just my thing, but all these people are saying it's like really good, and
it was a big topic, so it got a big reaction
right.
from both sides of that.
And it's like that's the internet, whatever. It's I don't I can't identify.
Gone Home has done everything to prove itself a pioneer of progressive indie video games. And not progressive as in politically or sociologically progressive in the face of how video games can be designed. It's a game that was built with a specific purpose in mind and fulfills that purpose pretty well. It's just a shame that the media surrounding this game doesn't actually want to speak on the game's merits and the intentions behind its design. This conclusion starts so hostile because feedback, or at least the presentation of feedback, is not always helpful to developers. In most cases, it's more valuable to analyze a game for the purpose of oneself. It's a video on the effects of Gone Home's subversion of player expectations, rather than a video on how Gone Home either fails or succeeds as a product. This video does not care about how players felt in response to Gone Home's release, and the methods in which it portrays itself. This video is established to understand where the game comes from, why it was built the way it was, and whether or not Gone Home is ultimately true to those internal goals. It's a game that strived to get away from AAA developers, a game that wanted to explore drama that any family could be facing, a game that wanted to subvert players' expectations right out of the gate. Fullbright's next game, Tacoma, takes these same elements but ramps up the production value to produce a product that may feel more complete to those who critiqued Gone Home. Gone Home is a game that ultimately isn't afraid of itself, and the designers of the game certainly aren't afraid of the negative reception that it received. Its awards and its legacy stands the test of time compared to the work that sought to brought it down, but can either of these necessarily be called failures? Does being on the losing side of the war mean that you are wrong? Critique fails when it tries to tell why a game failed through simply what it isn't. In many situations, this form of critique may work because a game doesn't have a defined scope, but this is ultimately a failing of those who do critique. There is not as strong of a market for critique as there is review, and the perspective of reviewers is far different from that of the critic. Gone Home has seen a complex set of circumstances surrounding its legacy, but is also a fascinating piece of media to analyze. It has had a substantial effect on the games industry for supposedly how preachy and boring and misleading it was, and old critique of this title doesn't really stand up today. And ultimately, shouldn't the purpose of video games be to leave an impact? Video games can be so much more than entertainment, and being entertainment is fine, but it's the titles that run deep, that paint a picture so beautiful and moving, that should be the ones to leave their marks in the games industry. Thanks for watching.